And I'm very happy to welcome to the programme Professor Eyal Winter, who is Professor of Hebrew Studies both at the Hebrew University and the University of Leicester. Good afternoon, Eyal.
Good afternoon, Pippa. Nice hearing you.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Now then, we saw this week actually on Monday, was it? I'm not quite sure, on the 13th, certainly, of October, that in the British Parliament there was a vote cast, and the vote went 274 votes to 12 to recognise a Palestinian state. Now, Palestine, of course, after the summer of really destructive war, is very much in the news, and we'll come to this. But I've asked you on today because this is connected to an article that you wrote some months ago now. Very, very interesting indeed. And that is about how we, the British public, actually digest the Palestine-Israel issue and how we choose to form our allegiances. I'll ask you to take this up.
Yeah, basically it was motivated by a personal experience that I had, and a book that I wrote called Rational Emotions, or Why Are Emotions More Rational Than We Think? And I was trying to figure out for myself why the British public responds so differently to violence in the Middle East than compared with other violence in the world. For instance, we've seen tens of thousands of people dying, civilians dying in Syria by the Assad regime. We've seen extraordinary violence in other places in the world, on which the British public, the British press, was completely silent. Okay, and then some people tell me, yes, but it's different. I mean, the Israelis killed during the Gaza conflict a lot of civilians, and Israel is part of the Western wall, so to say. Syria is part of a completely different world, so we are more concerned about what happens in our world, namely the Western world. And then I come up and ask, okay, let's see how certain we are that what happened now with the bombing in Iraq against ISIS is not causing the same civilian casualties as was in Gaza. Why was the reaction? Why there is no reaction towards the civilians' toll caused by the U.S. bombing now? Why wasn't there any mentioning of the civilian casualties during the Gulf Wars when Saddam Hussein was toppled? The U.S. is part of the Western world. Why is the reaction towards deeds that the U.S. government is doing that cause civilian casualties so different than Israel?
I think
some of my friends say, some of my Israeli friends say, listen, don't bother. They are anti-Semitic. That's in their blood. And I was trying to come up with a different explanation.
I think, first of all, when it comes to collateral damage, if you like, in other words, civilian deaths due to Western bombing, whether it be in the Gulf War or currently in collateral damage which is taking place, I think there certainly is some real reaction to that. The difference...
Not as much as there was
I think what we're talking about here, Eyal, is actually the difference, the way the media covers it. I mean, certainly I don't have to go very far to see a huge amount of resistance towards what is happening currently in the Middle East. But we're talking about the way the media reacts to this. And when it comes to Palestine, the BBC itself has been very much criticised for being far too pro-Palestine, biased towards Palestine. Now, this is what you question, and you question a British public's ability to basically digest this. And in your opinion, you seem to imply that the British have a a tendency to take a situation which they understand very, perhaps not in much depth, and cling to that, to their opinion and their support for the underdog, in this case Palestine. Now that in itself suggesting that their support of Palestine, I'm trying to find now the quote that you actually said, was more about social standing than it was about their understanding of what's going on in the region.
Right. Let me rephrase what you said. I mean, yes. The basic idea is that we individual, and it's not only Brits, it's all over the world. We individual want to convey to other individuals who we are. Are we liberal? Are we conservative? What our opinion? This is the way that we market ourselves. This is the way we generate our social environment, our social networking. And Israel became simply a symbol, or a signal that people are using in order to show that they are liberals. How do you show you are liberal? You curse Israel. You talk against Israel. You talk, I'm not talking about talking in favor of the Palestinian. I'm also a person who believes that the Palestinians should have their own state aside the state of Israel. So there's no problem with it. My problem is with the denouncing of the state of Israel. And I had several incidents. One I mentioned in the article in Oxford, where a guy approached me trying to get me to sign a protest by which his group is calling to annihilation of the state of Israel, to the complete destruction of the state of Israel. So I'm talking about these kind of things. And it occurred to me that people who know almost nothing about the conflict in the Middle East still find it attractive to use this as a signal, as a way of telling other people who they are.
But Eyal, you're stating this without actually giving any foundation for why. Why choose Israel? There are probably many other hobby horses that, if it's true what you say, and actually what you say, it's, and I quote you, being anti-Israeli, as many in the UK and Europe seem to be these days, is not so much about a worldview as it is about an attribute that helps social networks, just like style of dress, verbal intonation, and the choice of...
I'll tell you why it's Israel and not others. So denouncing, you agree with me that denouncing Syria and Assad is not going to put you in the liberal rubric, right? This is not what characterizes.
I agree with that, but I want to know.
So now I'll give you an answer. Why not the U.S.? And my answer to this, for instance, concerning the boycotts of Israeli academics, for instance, or the boycott of Israeli products, and my question, many ask me, why, or British people ask me, why weren't the British boycotting U.S. products when U.S. did equally terrible things that caused a lot of deaths among civilians? And my answer to this is simply because it's too expensive to boycott the U.S. It's much cheaper to boycott Israel. I want to see a serious academic that is going to commit not to invite any U.S. academics to his university, or not to buy any U.S. product. It's just more demanding. And so you use a signal which doesn't require too much from you. It doesn't require much effort. Doesn't require too much commitment. And this bring us back to Israel. Israel is a small country. Boycotting Israel is not going to create any damage to those people who are boycotting it. It's going to perhaps create a huge damage to Israel, but not to those who are boycotting it. And it's simply a very cheap signal to adopt.
Well, we're talking about boycotting. You're talking about individuals boycotting something. Now, I think perhaps one of the most high profile is Professor Stephen Hawking, who did call for a boycotting of Israel and was called for hypocrisy because certain of the technology made to help him speak, as I understand it, is actually Israeli designed and made. And so,
yeah, that's one thing. If you boycott a certain industry that is helping the Israeli army is one thing, but if you are calling, like George Galloway did, to ban the entrance of any Israeli academics to the University of Bradford, that's a different thing. And you won't be able to explain me this other boycott.
Okay, we're talking about boycotting, and perhaps we've jumped too far, because we actually haven't discussed here the issue that I picked up certainly from the article that you wrote, and that is that you felt that people were jumping upon the bandwagon because it's a left-wing liberal cause and it makes them look fashionable.
Yes.
And with that, Eyal, you are actually overlooking what many people are hugely angered about, and that is an immense destruction of human rights and a certain arrogance on the state of Israel, or certainly the administration of Israel. They have displayed a certain arrogance in believing that they are beyond reproach. Just this week we've
I'm not ignoring it. Let me.
Just this week we've actually seen that Israel have now announced building of further homes in East Jerusalem.
I'm very much against it, by the way.
We've just had $5 billion agreed in a donors meeting in Cairo, I believe it was, $5 billion of aid to rebuild Palestine, which is, as somebody on the news described it the other day, it looks like an earthquake's hit it. And there in East Jerusalem, the Israeli administration is allowing the go-ahead of more homes to be built for Jewish people.
Yes, but how much was mentioned about the rockets that were daily dropped on civilian population in Israel? How much of the press in the UK really emphasized the fact that people are stuck in their shelters for days, not going to work, not going to school?
Let me stop you there, though, Eyal, because people are stuck in the shelters for days in Israel, not being able to go to work, not being able to go to school. Whereas in Palestine, in there's certain parts of Palestine, people are stuck their whole lives. There is a blockade. Who was the major
cause? The Hamas has started attacking Israel. The whole thing started in response to firing against civilian population inside Israel. Israel didn't initiate the entire conflict.
But Israel has blockaded.
It was initiated by Hamas, and the whole response was a defensive response. It was meant to get Hamas to stop the firing against Israeli civilians. Do you imagine what would happen if tomorrow Germany or France would fire rockets into the British island, right? What would be the reaction? Or for instance, if Iran would manage to send missiles into British territory, killing British civilians, do you think the response, the military response of the British government would be milder than the Israeli one?
I do think that's a very.
I think it would be much more extreme.
I do think it's a very simplistic argument that you're making there. Although I respect what you're saying and I understand the point that you're making, but the fact is that we're again overlooking something, and that is the quite lengthy blockade that the Palestinians have been under for some time, imposed by Israel. But that's not what I asked you on to speak about today. I'm interested to know. The article that you wrote suggesting that the British public perhaps aren't educated enough about what's really going on there and are picking up that hobby horse because it's an appendage, it makes them look fashionable in some way, it makes them certainly into the clique that they want to stay in. And all of that, and all of that becomes very patronising. And then on top of that, there is a call of anti-Semitism, which is hurled at people who are putting out a voice against human rights atrocities that they're seeing. We're talking about children being killed. We're talking about, tens of...
I'm against this explanation. I think it's not about anti-Semitism. Although if you ask most Israelis, they will say it is about.
Let me ask you about that then, because you're an Israeli, you're a Hebrew professor. I want to know what you feel about that, because you've just quite rightly said most Israelis, or should we say most Jewish Israeli sympathisers, because I know Jews who are anti-Israel. Let's make that very clear. I really do.
I'll tell you why many people... Yeah, I'll tell you why many people in Israel think it's anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And this is basically because the double standard that is used. There's one standard which Israel has to abide by, and there is other standard that the entire world has to abide by. This double standard, this hypocrisy, lead people to believe that there is anti-Semitism behind it, that there is, it's not rational, there's no rational explanation for it, it's just hating Jews.
Put that double standard into a very short context for us for the sake of this interview.
No, I mentioned the double standard complaining against Israel, quotation mark, atrocities, so to speak, relative to much more horrible stuff that is happening daily in other places in the world, including by Western countries. So this is a double standard. This is the fact that Israel is so often, so aggressively in the media, in such a negative way, lead people to think, I think is wrong, but lead many people to think that it's all coming because of hating Jews.
So there's you're suggesting there that there's a significant sympathy towards Palestine, and that perhaps the media is pro-Palestine more than it is Israel. And yet, with some atrocities committed on both sides, but certainly some committed by the Israeli administration's troops, which could be signalled as war crimes. But Israel won't stand.
It's really not atrocities. It's the Israeli military is trying to target Hamas activists, Hamas militants that are firing rockets into Israel. That's where the rockets. That's where the fire is aimed at. And of course, because they hide themselves in a civilian population, most prominently hospitals, intentionally, by the way, it becomes technically completely unavoidable that and civilians do get killed.
But there is significant evidence.
And if you ask, no Israeli person, no Israeli citizens would feel happy about the fact that civilians are being dead.
There are significant schools of thought or spokespeople who've said that actually that wasn't true, and one of them included a very eminent and very highly respected Channel 4 news presenter called Jon Snow. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, who himself went to the areas that you're talking about, and he categorically denied that there were any so-called Hamas terrorists in the hospital that he'd visited, which had been bombed. And in which
there are objective journalists, many, by the way, not Israeli ones, not even with special relations to Israel, that say exactly the opposite. So I doubt what he says, but the proof is on his side. He has to provide a proof for that. There is a lot of proof that have been provided.
But then it could be stated, couldn't it, that there is the hypocrisy there, because you're saying that Israel is judged differently to other regimes in other parts of the world, other administrations in other parts of the world. But then you could also say that Jon Snow, who is pro-Palestine, has to provide proof. Well, when many people
provided a lot of proofs. There are lots of journalists that provided pictures showing missiles located in front of a UN building, in front of hospitals, in schools in Gaza. What do you need more than that? Why their information is inaccurate, whereas the person you're naming information is correct and clear? I don't get it.
Let me ask you, please, Eyal, before I have to let you go, just on this week seeing the British Parliament voting 260, I think it was, to 12 votes, that the state of Palestine should be recognised. Now, this is a rhetorical vote. It doesn't mean anything's going to happen. Yeah. But what do you take from that?
I'll tell you one thing. I said first that I'm very much in favor.
Yes, you did say.
And by the way, I'm considered left wing in Israel. I'm working a lot for peace with my Palestinian friends in East Jerusalem. And I think eventually a Palestinian state should be established, and this is important. This is the only way to solve the problem. What I'm worried about is these votes that start now in the UK and will probably spread to other places will be an excuse for the international community to step down from the entire conflict and basically do nothing. It will give them sort of a good conscience that they did something for the conflict. They support a Palestinian state, but then they'll say, now get off our shoulders. We don't want to deal with it anymore. And this is the most frightening thing, most frightening prospect for peace in Middle East. So I think I don't believe in ceremonial actions. This is a pure ceremonial actions. A concrete action needs to be taken in building up the Palestinian infrastructure, in controlling, making sure that weapon is not flowing into Gaza and used by militants again to lead the fire. These concrete and meaningful steps should be used by the international community rather than just doing ceremonial votings. I don't think it's helpful.
Professor Eyal Winter, we have to leave it there. Most interesting listening to you, being somebody obviously who studies the issue both from the standpoint of being over in Israel and spending the rest of your time over at the University of Leicester. It's been a pleasure hearing you today. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.